Right now, every major quantum computing company on Earth, every single one except one, is quietly dependent on a factory in Germany to build the most critical component in their machines. One company just ended that dependency. And in doing so, it may have just made every other quantum computer on the planet obsolete before it even scales. That company is IonQ. And what happened on July 31st, 2026 was not just another corporate acquisition. It was the moment the entire logic of the quantum computing industry quietly shifted underneath everyone's feet. And most people watching the stock ticker had no idea it was happening. For years, the story of quantum computing has been told as a physics story. Cooler qubits, longer coherence times, fancier error correction algorithms, researchers in white coats hunched over dilution refrigerators, chasing fractions of a percent in fidelity. That story was never wrong, exactly. But it was incomplete. Because underneath all of that physics sits a much more boring, much more industrial problem. Somebody has to actually build the chip. Somebody has to take a design that exists on a screen and turn it into a physical piece of silicon with atomic-level precision, at scale, reliably, over and over again. And for the entire history of trapped ion quantum computing, that job has belonged to somebody else. Specifically, it has belonged to Infineon Technologies, a semiconductor manufacturer based in Germany. If you have followed the quantum computing space even casually, you have probably never heard that name mentioned in the same breath as quantum computing. And that is exactly the point. Infineon is not a quantum company. It does not build quantum computers. It builds chips at industrial scale for a huge range of customers, and quantum computing firms have simply been one more client on a very long list. IonQ used them. Their closest and most direct competitor, Quantinuum, still uses them today. In fact, virtually every trapped ion quantum computing company on the planet, right now, in this moment, is quietly renting fabrication capacity from a European chip maker whose primary business has nothing to do with quantum mechanics at all. Think about what that actually means for a second. The chip at the heart of a trapped ion quantum computer is not some generic piece of silicon. It is an ion trap chip, a highly specialized piece of engineering that has to hold individual charged atoms in place using precisely tuned electromagnetic fields, while lasers manipulate those atoms to perform calculations. Every improvement to that chip, every redesign, every new generation of the technology has to go through somebody else's factory, on somebody else's timeline, subject to somebody else's priorities. If Infineon has a backlog, if Infineon has a supply chain hiccup, if Infineon decides a different client's order takes priority this quarter, that is now IonQ's problem, or Quantinuum's problem, or anyone else's problem who depends on that same pipeline. And here is the part that should really make you sit up. This is not a niche vulnerability buried in some technical appendix. This is the central bottleneck of the entire industry. Quantum computing right now is in a race. A genuine, high-stakes, multi-billion-dollar race to scale from machines with a few dozen or a few hundred qubits to machines with hundreds of thousands, and eventually millions of qubits. And scaling a quantum computer is not like scaling a piece of software, where you can just spin up more servers. It requires physically manufacturing more and better chips, generation after generation, faster than your competitors can. Whoever controls the speed of that manufacturing loop controls the speed of the entire industry's progress. IonQ figured that out. And instead of continuing to rent someone else's factory, they bought one. On July 31st, 2026, IonQ completed a $1.8 billion acquisition of SkyWater Technology, the largest exclusively United States-based semiconductor foundry in existence. This deal had actually been announced back in January of 2026, and it spent the following months working its way through regulatory review, including a period of genuine uncertainty when the Federal Trade Commission issued a second request for information in April, essentially pressing pause to scrutinize whether the deal could distort competition in the still emerging quantum computing market. That kind of second request is not a rubber stamp process. It signals real scrutiny. And there were reportedly internal disagreements among the commissioners themselves about whether conditions should be attached to the approval. In the end, the FTC cleared the acquisition outright with no conditions imposed at all. And on the last Friday of July, the deal closed. With that single transaction, IonQ became something that had never existed before in the history of quantum computing. A single company that owns, end-to-end, the entire pipeline from raw qubit physics all the way through chip design, chip fabrication, advanced packaging, and final system deployment. Not a partnership, not a supply agreement. Ownership. IonQ now describes itself as the only vertically integrated full-stack quantum platform company on the planet. And for the moment at least, that description is accurate. Nobody else in the industry can currently say the same thing. Let's sit with that phrase for a moment, vertically integrated, because it is doing a lot of work here and it is worth unpacking properly. In a normal, horizontally structured industry, different companies specialize in different layers of a supply chain and then transact with each other. One company designs, another company manufactures, a third company assembles and sells. Everybody stays in their lane, and the coordination between those lanes happens through contracts, purchase orders, and negotiated timelines. That is how almost the entire quantum computing industry has operated up until now, and frankly, it is how a huge amount of the broader technology industry still operates. Vertical integration means collapsing those separate lanes into a single organization. It means the people designing the next generation of ion trap chips and the people actually manufacturing those chips sit inside the same company, answer to the same leadership, and can coordinate directly without the friction of external contracts and competing priorities. Why does that matter so much for quantum computing specifically? Because quantum computing right now is not a mature, stable manufacturing process the way, say, consumer smartphone chips are. It is an actively evolving technology where the design of the chip itself is still being refined generation after generation at a rapid pace. Every new insight from the physics side, every improvement in how ions are trapped, controlled, or connected, potentially requires a redesign of the chip. In a horizontally structured supply chain, every one of those redesigns has to be communicated to an outside foundry, translated into their process requirements, scheduled into their production calendar, and then manufactured on their timeline. Each of those handoffs adds delay. Each of those handoffs adds risk of miscommunication. Each of those handoffs adds cost. When you own the foundry yourself, all of that friction collapses. IonQ has said explicitly that this acquisition is designed to shorten quantum chip development cycles by allowing its engineering teams to iterate wafer designs more rapidly and to manufacture prototype devices in-house, rather than waiting in line at somebody else's facility. Reduced wafer iteration times, the ability to parallelize wafer prototypes, running multiple experimental designs through the fabrication process simultaneously instead of one at a time. These are not marketing buzzwords. They translate directly into how fast a company can move from a promising idea on a whiteboard to a working chip in a working quantum computer. And in an industry where the entire competitive landscape is defined by who scales fastest, speed of iteration might be the single most valuable currency there is. Now let's talk about SkyWater itself, because this was not some struggling second-tier facility that IonQ picked up cheap. SkyWater is a serious, established player in American semiconductor manufacturing. It holds accreditation from the Defense Microelectronics Activity, known as DMEA, and specifically carries Category 1A trusted status, which is the kind of designation the United States government requires when it wants assurance that sensitive chips are being designed, fabricated, and packaged entirely within secure, vetted domestic facilities with no foreign involvement anywhere in the process. That status matters enormously for a company like IonQ, which has increasingly positioned itself around government, defense, and national security customers, where questions about supply chain security are not abstract concerns but hard requirements written into contracts. SkyWater's footprint spans facilities in Minnesota, Florida, and Texas, and following the acquisition, those locations are being positioned as regional quantum production hubs, extending the company's manufacturing capability across multiple sites within the United States. SkyWater will continue to operate under its own name, led by its existing chief executive, who will report up to IonQ's chairman and CEO. Critically, SkyWater is not being shut down or absorbed into some internal-only operation. It continues to serve its existing base of external semiconductor customers as a merchant foundry, meaning outside companies that have nothing to do with quantum computing can still bring their chip designs to SkyWater and have them manufactured there, just as they did before the acquisition. IonQ has been explicit about this point, describing SkyWater as remaining fully committed to its existing foundry customers, even as it takes on this new role serving IonQ's quantum ambitions. So what does IonQ actually plan to do with all of this newly acquired manufacturing muscle? The roadmap is genuinely audacious. The combined company has laid out a goal of beginning functional testing of a 200,000 qubit quantum processing unit by 2028. To put that number in context, that is an enormous leap from where trapped ion quantum computers stand today, and it is not just about raw qubit count for its own sake. The company's stated goal is that a machine at that scale would enable more than 8,000 ultra-high fidelity logical qubits. Logical qubits, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, are the error-corrected, reliable computational units that get built up out of many physical qubits working together to compensate for the inherent fragility and error-proneness of individual qubits. Physical qubits are noisy and prone to error. Logical qubits are what you actually need in large numbers if you want a quantum computer to reliably solve problems that matter, whether that is simulating new pharmaceutical molecules, optimizing complex financial portfolios, or breaking certain forms of encryption. Getting from a few dozen noisy physical qubits to thousands of clean, dependable logical qubits is widely regarded as one of the defining engineering challenges of this entire field, and it is a challenge that depends heavily on exactly the kind of rapid, iterative chip manufacturing that vertical integration is designed to accelerate. Beyond the 2028 milestone, IonQ has talked about a longer arc stretching toward a 2 million qubit system. And separately, the company has cited independent analysis suggesting that the physical components required to build a machine at that staggering scale could, in 2025 dollars, cost less than $30 million. Whether or not every one of these projections holds up exactly as stated years from now, the direction of travel is unmistakable. IonQ is betting its entire strategic identity on the idea that the bottleneck to fault-tolerant quantum computing was never purely a physics problem. It was a manufacturing problem. And manufacturing problems get solved by owning factories, refining processes, and iterating faster than anyone else in the room. It is worth pausing here to ask an honest, skeptical question, because a good story deserves scrutiny, not blind repetition. Does owning a foundry actually make classical chip fabs unable to compete, the way the boldest version of this narrative claims? The honest answer is more nuanced than the headline suggests. SkyWater itself is, at its core, a conventional semiconductor foundry. It is not some secret proprietary manufacturing technology that no other fab on Earth could theoretically replicate. Companies like TSMC, Global Foundries, and yes, Infineon itself, are not technically incapable of fabricating the kinds of chips quantum computing companies need. What IonQ has actually secured through this acquisition is not an exclusive technological capability that locks competitors out by law of physics. What it has secured is ownership, control, and priority. IonQ's designs now go to the front of IonQ's own production line on IonQ's own timeline without having to negotiate calendar space with an outside client base that has its own priorities and its own paying customers. That distinction matters because it reframes what this acquisition really represents. It is not that classical chip fabs cannot technically build what quantum computing needs. It is that no other quantum computing company currently has the same kind of direct, unmediated ownership level control over its own supply chain that IonQ now has. Every other trapped ion competitor is still, for now, a customer standing in line, while IonQ is the landlord of its own factory floor. That is a meaningful structural advantage, potentially a decisive one in a race defined by iteration speed. But it is a business and operational advantage, not an unbreakable technical moat that no other company could ever replicate through its own future acquisitions or partnerships. Analysts covering the deal have framed it in exactly these terms, describing the move as reframing quantum progress as fundamentally a manufacturing problem, one that raises the bar for every competitor, still dependent on third-party foundries, and that pressures the rest of the industry to seriously rethink its own foundry strategy going forward. That framing competitive pressure and a raised bar is a more accurate and defensible read than the flatter claim that classical fabs simply cannot compete at all. There's also a practical, unglamorous reality that deserves airtime here because breathless headlines tend to skip right past it. Closing an acquisition on paper is not the same thing as instantly transforming how chips get made. Reporting around the deal has been candid about this. The completion of the transaction did not immediately transform IonQ's chip production capabilities overnight. Integrating a newly acquired foundry into a quantum computing company's specific workflows is a months-long undertaking at minimum. It requires establishing new process recipes tailored to quantum-specific chip designs. It requires qualifying equipment to make sure it performs to the exacting standards quantum applications demand. It requires training a combined workforce, blending SkyWater's existing semiconductor manufacturing expertise with IonQ's quantum-specific engineering needs, so that the two organizations can actually function as one coordinated unit rather than two separate companies sharing a logo. What changed the moment the deal closed was structural and strategic. Qubit physics, chip design, chip manufacturing, and system deployment now all sit under a single corporate roof on United States soil for the first time in the industry's history. What has not changed yet, and will take real time to materialize, is the full operational payoff of that structure in the form of faster product cycles and lower costs. Now let's talk numbers, because this story is not just a strategic narrative, it is also showing up clearly in IonQ's financial results. The company's first quarterly earnings report as a combined entity, covering the second quarter of 2026, landed on August 5th, and the results were striking. Revenue for the quarter came in at $80.1 million, representing growth of 287% compared to the same quarter a year earlier. That is not incremental growth. That is the kind of number that tends to make an entire sector sit up and pay attention. International revenue, commercial revenue, and revenue spanning multiple product lines were all up year over year, which suggests this growth is not concentrated in a single lucky contract, but spread across a genuinely broadening customer base. Following that report, IonQ raised its full year 2026 revenue guidance to a range of $280 to $290 million, while simultaneously reaffirming its expectation that its core quantum computing business, independent of any acquisitions, would roughly double organically over the course of the year. The company's remaining performance obligations, essentially contracted future revenue that has not yet been recognized, grew by nearly 300% year over year, which is often read by analysts as a signal of genuine forward demand rather than one-off deal activity. All of this is happening against a backdrop of years of aggressive acquisition activity that set the stage for the SkyWater deal in the first place. IonQ did not simply wake up one day and decide to buy a chip foundry out of nowhere. This fits a clear, deliberate pattern stretching back years. The company acquired qubits to build out networking capability. It later acquired ID Quantique, a pioneer in quantum-safe cryptography, and Oxford Ionics, a company focused on improving the accuracy and precision of quantum computations, in a deal reportedly worth around $1.1 billion. It picked up LightSync, focused on quantum memory and interconnects, Capella Space, a satellite operator, and Vector Atomic, a maker of quantum sensing technology. More recently, it added Nexus Photonics, expanding its integrated photonics capabilities, and Seed Innovations, a company with deep roots in machine learning, cloud migration, and software development for government and defense clients, brought on specifically to help build the artificial intelligence-powered software layers needed to manage and scale increasingly complex quantum workloads. Piece by piece, acquisition by acquisition, IonQ has been assembling not just a quantum computer, but an entire ecosystem: computing, networking, sensing, security, and now manufacturing. Buying capability rather than building it from scratch is a strategy with real risks attached. Every one of these acquisitions brings with it the genuine unglamorous work of integrating different corporate cultures, different technical teams, and different existing systems into something that actually functions as one coherent organization rather than a loose federation of formerly independent companies now sharing a parent brand. That is true of the smaller acquisitions, and it is especially true of a deal the size and complexity of SkyWater, an entire established semiconductor foundry with its own decades of institutional knowledge, its own existing customer relationships, and its own operational culture, now being folded into a quantum computing company's strategic vision. IonQ has effectively bet that the benefits of controlling every layer of its own stack outweigh the very real execution risk of trying to integrate that many moving pieces successfully and quickly. Whether that bet pays off in full is genuinely still an open question, and reasonable observers, including plenty of financial analysts, are watching closely rather than simply assuming success is guaranteed. The market's reaction to all of this has been telling in its own right, even if it has not been a straight line upward. In the weeks surrounding the deal's closing and the subsequent earnings report, IonQ's stock swung through a wide range, moving from roughly the low 30s up toward the mid-40s, before settling somewhere in between. That kind of volatility is not unusual for a young, still unprofitable company making an enormous, expensive bet on its own future, and it reflects a genuine split in how investors are pricing the story. Some see a company finally translating years of acquisition spending into a coherent, defensible, competitive position, backed by triple-digit revenue growth and raised guidance. Others see a company still operating deeply in the red, taking on the operational complexity of an entire semiconductor foundry on top of an already ambitious quantum computing roadmap, in an industry where commercial payoff for many players remains years away. Both of those readings can be true at the same time. This is not a settled verdict on whether the SkyWater acquisition was the right call. It is an enormous, calculated wager, made with real capital and real operational risk, and the market is still actively working out how much confidence that wager deserves. It is also worth being clear-eyed about the language being used here, because words like only and first tend to do a lot of persuasive heavy lifting in corporate communications, and it is worth remembering exactly where that language is coming from. The description of IonQ as the world's only vertically integrated full-stack quantum platform company originates primarily from IonQ itself, in its own press releases and its own investor communications. That does not make the claim false. As of right now, based on everything publicly known, no other quantum computing company does, in fact, own its chip fabrication the way IonQ now does. But it is IonQ's own framing of its own accomplishment, not some independent neutral verdict handed down by an outside regulator or standards body. Independent industry analysts covering the deal have tended to describe it in more measured terms, as a move that reframes the competitive landscape and raises the bar for rivals, rather than as a development that instantly and permanently locks every competitor out of the race for good. So where does that leave the rest of the industry, and specifically, where does it leave Quantinuum, the company most directly named as still dependent on that external German supply chain? Nothing in the public reporting suggests Quantinuum is somehow trapped or unable to pursue its own alternative arrangements going forward. Companies facing a competitive disadvantage do not simply sit still and accept it. It would not be surprising to see rival quantum computing firms pursue their own foundry partnerships, their own acquisitions, or their own manufacturing investments in direct response to what IonQ has just done. Competitive pressure of exactly this kind tends to reshape an entire industry over time, not just the single company that made the first bold move. The more accurate way to understand this moment is not that IonQ has permanently and single-handedly won the quantum computing race through one acquisition. It is that IonQ has redefined what winning that race is actually going to require, and it has forced every other serious competitor to now reckon with a dimension of the competition, industrial manufacturing capability that many of them may not have been prepared to fight on. There is also a broader story unfolding here about how the entire framing of technological progress is quietly shifting, and it goes well beyond just IonQ or just quantum computing as a narrow topic. For years, breakthroughs in emerging technology were framed almost entirely around laboratory science, new materials, new algorithms, new physics discovered on a whiteboard or inside an experimental apparatus. What this moment in quantum computing's history suggests, and what echoes across other frontier technologies as well, is that turning a laboratory breakthrough into something that can actually scale to serve real customers, real governments, and real economic value depends just as much on industrial capacity as it does on scientific insight. The company that figures out how to manufacture something reliably, repeatedly, and at increasing scale often ends up capturing more of the long-term value than the company that merely discovered the underlying phenomenon first. IonQ's bet on SkyWater is, in that sense, a bet on an old and well-established industrial truth being rediscovered inside a brand new field. That scientific discovery gets the headlines, but manufacturing capability determines who actually wins the market. An investor day is scheduled for September 8th, 2026. Where IonQ's combined leadership team is expected to lay out a more detailed strategic roadmap for exactly how this newly merged entity intends to operate going forward, including presumably much more granular detail on foundry utilization, production timelines, and how quickly that promised acceleration in chip iteration speed is actually beginning to show up in practice rather than just in press releases. That date will likely serve as the next serious checkpoint for anyone trying to judge whether this bet is translating from bold strategic vision into measurable operational reality. Until then, what can be said with real confidence is this. On July 31st, 2026, the quantum computing industry quietly crossed a threshold it had never crossed before. One company now owns, from the atomic physics of trapped ions all the way through to the final packaged chip, rolling out of a United States-based factory. Every single layer of the stack that used to require negotiating with outside partners at every step along the way. Whether that structural advantage proves decisive over the coming years, or whether the rest of the industry finds its own way to close the gap, is a question that will play out not in a single press release, but across years of quarterly earnings reports, roadmap milestones, and ultimately, working machines that either do or do not deliver on the scale that has been promised. But for right now, in this specific moment, there's exactly one company in the world that can point to a factory on American soil and say, with complete accuracy, that it owns every step of the process from qubit to quantum computer. And that fact alone is reason enough for the rest of the industry to be paying very close attention.